Hi, I'm Cameron. This is a presentation on my honors thesis that I started this summer on how Bronze Age Cretan burials represent Minoan women. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Brit, or Artistfully on Instagram, for allowing me to use her beautiful paintings of Minoan women that she based them off of Minoan frescoes. So thank you so much. So starting off, I want to share with you my thesis structure. My thesis will be split into 3 chapters. The first chapter, and my main focus of the presentation that I'm giving you today, is about the scholarship of the Minoans, really their history and the history of us discovering them and our interpretations of them, as well as gender archaeology and how I plan to incorporate gender archaeology into my thesis. The second chapter will focus on Sissy Cemetery, and I'll be extracting data from it based on sexed individuals and the burial goods that were with them. And then in the third chapter, I will be comparing that data from the Sissy Cemetery to a Mycenaean cemetery, just because the Mycenaean culture were a contemporary society to the Minoans, and they had a stronger, more definitive gender binary. So I want to see if they have any similar patterns between their burial goods, the sex of the skeletons, and possibly what we can tell about their gender identities. So you can't talk about the Minoan societies without Sir Arthur Evans. He's widely credited with discovering Minoan society due to his extensive excavations during the early 1900s. More often in modern scholarship today, we see we're more disassembling his work, as it was really encouraged by the cultural and intellectual currents of his time, but also by his own personal experience and bias. Some scholars even like to say that he had a very romantic imagination that he used to make his interpretations of the Minoans, instead of using objective analysis of the data present. What first led him to Crete was the promise of a form of writing that predated the Phoenician alphabet, and this made him really want to pitch Crete as the cradle of European society. He's basically trying to prove that European history or prehistory was just as old as Egyptian or Middle Eastern, and he really wanted a connection to, Europe and, Greek culture even older than that, since they were the greatest achievements of Europe at that time. Most of what we know about the Minoans comes from their art and their iconography, just because they don't have a text that we can translate. So really everything that we understand about them comes from interpretation from, the archaeological record. Representational art appeared in Crete around the latter half of the Bronze Age, with figural representation developing in the Neopalatial period. However, a lot of this art and iconography is very fractured, and it means that we have to take very liberal steps to kind of recreating it and to understand the full picture. Evans tried to punt Minoan art and iconography as like the fullest picture of the past and the true image of the Minoans. However, this is really problematic because it kind of assumes that their art and their symbols are absolute, and how we're interpreting them is exactly what they wanted to mean, which is just really probably not possible. Not to mention that a lot of actually gendering figures in Minoan art is very difficult, because there can be a lot of interpretations and usually requires the presence of multiple factors and indicators to determine a gender or of a figure instead of just one. Now moving on to Mediterranean archaeology, and particularly how we use gender in it, is a very difficult topic. Archaeologists can be accused of projecting our own norms and values on the past, especially when it comes to gender ideology, because we look at a lot of societies and objects with this gender polarity. Lynn Foxall actually considers gender to be one of the most difficult objects of historical study, because it's almost impossible to detach gender from ourselves, because it's such an important part of our society and of who we are and identify as today. So actually a lot of our roots of prehistory and how we interpret them and explain them is through ethnographic or ethnohistoric data for analogical comparison, usually for continuities, but also to try and associate activities with different people and particular activities with material cultures that could potentially indicate gender or some sort of status. So because of this difficulty in how difficult it is actually to see that in the archaeological record, gender archaeology has to be quite self-critical in these studies because we need to make sure that our bias and assumptions are separate. So when we look at gender in archaeological studies, we actually need to be studying it more of as a component of a society's social organization instead of trying to fit individuals, burial goods, activities into certain boxes or appropriate roles, trying to make everything feminine or masculine, female or male. So we kind of just need to look at it as more as a tool to understand the status and how society works. So, like I mentioned, I will be using the analysis of burial goods in my thesis. And this is not the first time that people have used burial goods to kind of indicate or understand gender. Archaeologists have long sought out the concepts of gender and sex and how they were expressed and communicated in different societies through the material culture. Before post-processualism, archaeologists saw material items as passive and that they reflected the gender differences of society. Nowadays, we know they're actually more active agents with the potential for expression, but that expression is invested in those objects by the people who use them, and in the context of burials, by the people who are buried with them. So we see a lot with sexing skeletons that sometimes we then sex material items as well. If we find a female skeleton, we might suggest that the items buried with her are therefore female, and then try to use that as a differential agent in other burials, which is a little bit fast, and we need to try separate the burial goods from the deceased, because in reality these burial goods were buried by the living with that person. So it cannot be assumed that those goods were specifically trying to indicate status or gender, or that they were even a personal item of that deceased. So can we use burial goods at all? Well, yes, we still can. Material culture is a very integrated component of social life. And if gender is an important structure of a society, it can be traceable. We just need to be careful with how we understand and use burial goods. They're still useful for the study of societies and cultures because they were still chosen by the living of those societies and those cultures. And there's obviously a reason behind those choices. So this does inform us about that society. It just may not inform us of that particular deceased and their day-to-day and their gendered lives. But that doesn't mean that burial goods are useless. They are still very important. Lastly, here is a quick look at the site that I will be analyzing. This Sissi is about 45 kilometers away from Knossos and 4 kilometers of the Palace Center at Melia. The site was first on the Kefli, and it was first founded with foundations as old as 26,000 BCE, and we see that it's remained occupied until the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. The cemetery itself is on the summit of the hill, and it's installed by the north part of the hill, which is close to the sea. And I am very excited to dig deeper into what is there. So I just want to say thank you for listening to me. I'm really excited to keep going with this thesis and complete it by the end of my final year in May. And yeah, maybe I'll share the results with you next year. Thank you so much.